Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's conversation today on religious freedom in Nigeria. My name is Dwight Bashir, and I'm Director of Outreach and Policy at USCIRF. For those of you not familiar, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan federal advisory body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. Today's discussion will focus on Nigeria. USCIRF has been reporting on Nigeria for over 15 years and since 2009 has recommended that the State Department designate Nigeria a country of particular concern, or CPC, for engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of international religious freedom. In December 2020, for the first time, the State Department followed this recommendation and designated Nigeria a CPC, making Nigeria the first secular democracy to be designated as such. While a number of challenges contribute to poor religious freedom conditions in Nigeria, today's discussion will focus on local actors and stakeholders, how they're contributing to religious freedom violations, the role they can play in overcoming these challenges, and how the U.S. government can more effectively engage local actors in promoting freedom of religion and belief for all Nigerians. I am joined today by two of our commissioners, Vice Chair Tony Perkins and Commissioner Fred Davie. We are also joined by two expert panelists, Oge Onubogu, Senior Program Officer for Nigeria at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Nnamdi Obasi, Senior Advisor on Nigeria at the International Crisis Group. Today's event will begin with opening remarks from Vice Chair Perkins, who will focus on religious freedom violations committed by non-state actors with a focus on Kaduna State. And then Commissioner Davie will delve into violations committed by state authorities. Then we will hear from Ms. Onubogu, followed by Dr. Obasi. Afterwards, I'll moderate a brief conversation among the speakers with a couple of opening questions. Following that, there'll be time for some questions from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen to submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event, starting now. I understand we will not have with us initially Vice Chair Perkins, so what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Commissioner Davie at this time to go ahead with your opening remarks. If we could take you off mute. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Dwight, and apologies for that. Am I delivering my remarks and Commissioner Perkins, or do you just want me to go straight to my remarks?
Why don't you go ahead and launch it from the top, because we understand he's having some technical difficulties, and we'll just go from the top.
Absolutely. Let me say how pleased I am to be able to stand in for Vice Chair Perkins for this time, either for the entire panel or until he can join us. And let me thank all those who have joined us here today, including our distinguished panelists, for this important discussion. It is an extremely relevant time to be discussing religious freedom conditions in Nigeria. In December, as Dwight mentioned, the State Department designated Nigeria a country of particular concern for the first time for tolerating and engaging in systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of international religious freedom. The U.S. Congress on December 15th also held a hearing to identify drivers of religious violence in north-central Nigeria's Middle Belt and opportunities for constructive engagement. Then, tragically, as December came to a close, Boko Haram followed through on threats to target Christian communities. In 3 separate attacks, 2 on Christmas Eve and 1 the day after Christmas, Boko Haram fighters killed 12 Nigerians and abducted several others, including an evangelist preacher in several villages in the north of the country. There is no dearth of angles from which to explore Nigeria's significant religious freedom challenges. However, the topic we are honing in on today is rarely breached in are broached in conversations on religious freedom in Nigeria. Local authorities like state governors and local courts wield enormous power and influence in Nigeria's federalized and decentralized democracy. In some instances, this has meant they are apathetic, if not complicit, in the myriad religious freedom violations occurring in the country. On a more hopeful note, I can't help but wonder if in other instances, they may represent an untapped resource for US policymakers to engage in putting an end to these violations and preventing new ones from occurring. As an example, I want to draw attention to Kaduna State located in Nigeria's north central region. Kaduna has experienced a near tripling of violent incidents in the past year, with roughly 400 persons abducted for ransom and the displacement of 50,000 people. And while the drivers of this violence are many and complex, there can be no doubt that Christian communities have borne the brunt of the violence in a state led by predominantly Muslim leadership. The response of Kaduna Governor Nasir El-Rufai has been woefully inadequate. El-Rufai is simply incompetent, neglectful, or complicit in the violence that remains. Whether El-Rufai is simply incompetent, neglectful, or complicit in the violence remains up for debate. But what is not up for debate is that he and his administration could be doing more to hold perpetrators accountable. Inaction in this divided state has led many on both sides to believe the governor favors Muslims over Christians. Attackers have been reported to chant things like, "This land is ours, the governor is ours," during attacks. Christians point to inequitably enforced curfews and opaque peace negotiations with the militants as examples that the state government is collaborating with the perpetrators. These narratives are tearing apart the social fabric of the state and contributing to escalation of interfaith distrust and violence. In my mind, action at the state level could be a huge pacifying impact on the situation. Should we engage directly with El-Rufai and his administration? How could we pressure Kaduna State leadership to alleviate the burden on Christian communities there? These are questions on my mind, and I hope during this discussion, our distinguished panelists may be able to speak to them further. However, we also know that in Nigeria, it is not just about non-state actors committing religious freedom violations. State authorities have directly committed to these violations, have directly committed to these violations against Nigerian citizens. This perhaps is no better exemplified over the past year than by developments in Kano State, a state in Nigeria's north, just north of Kaduna. Kano is one of 12 northern states where state-sanctioned Sharia courts operate in parallel with secular courts, an arrangement that is provided for under the 1999 Nigerian Constitution. In August, a Sharia court in Kano State convicted 2 Nigerians of blasphemy, 22-year-old Yahaya Sharif Aminu and 13-year-old Omar Farouk. They were both detained, and each having been convicted of insulting the Prophet Muhammad in private interactions. Fortunately, a higher court recently overturned these sentences due to irregularities during the trials, which were held in private in violation of Nigeria's constitution. However, the case against Sharif Aminu will be retried, and he may well be found guilty of blasphemy again and delivered a harsh sentence. What's more, Kano State authorities collaborated with Kaduna police to arrest and illegally detain Mubarak Bala, a prominent atheist, activist, and president of Nigeria's Humanist Association. Although Mr. Bala has yet to be charged, the arrest came following a petition by lawyers in Kano State accusing him of insulting the Prophet Muhammad in Facebook posts. For months after his arrest, Kano State authorities denied access to his legal team and refused to provide information on his whereabouts, well-being, or charges. Finally, after months of delays, a federal court in Abuja in December ruled Mr. Bala's detention unconstitutional and ordered him to be released. Yet more than a month after that verdict, he still remains detained by Kano State Police. Many US officials are frustrated that their efforts to advocate on behalf of these young men with federal Nigerian authorities fall short. As a commissioner who advocates for both Mubarak Bala and Yahya Sharif Aminu as a part of USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience program, I find myself among those frustrated. It leads me to ask, how can we work to protect religious freedom for Nigerians in the country's hyper-decentralized system? And what options are available to encourage proactively and apply pressure on local authorities in Kano State and elsewhere? Hopefully, we can uncover some answers as we turn now to our first speaker. Ms. Onubogu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Davie, and thank you, Dwight. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I am Director for the West Africa Program at USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, where part of my portfolio also includes coverage of Nigeria. If you would permit me, for those who are not familiar with USIP, USIP is an independent, non-partisan national institute that is charged with a mission to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. We actually achieve our mission by linking training and analysis, research and policy, and by supporting those who are working at the front lines of conflict around the world. We've been working in Nigeria for over a decade and working to build trust between local security forces and the communities, and also working to facilitate dialogues to mitigate intercommunal violence and partnering with civic leaders and policymakers to strengthen relationships between citizens and government and to deepen citizen participation in the decision-making process. Now, I'd like to frame my remarks around 3 points. Around this, on the question of how to effectively engage local and state government actors in promoting religious freedoms in Nigeria. The first point for me basically is really, we need to approach our understanding of Nigeria with some humility. Nigeria is a very complex country, as has already been mentioned, and it's not a conventional nation state in the way we think about typical countries. We have to understand, when we look at conflict in Nigeria, when religion is a driver and when religion is used as a tool to manipulate conflict. It's important that we understand that how we approach or mitigate conflicts that arise from both of those episodes are very different. So as a first step in thinking about how we engage with local actors or state actors is for us to approach our understanding of Nigeria with humility. The second point is really thinking about how we combine top-down accountability with bottom-up innovation, learning, and accountability. There's so much happening at the state and local level in Nigeria. And since 2015, USIP decided to take a different approach in our focus in Nigeria and started focusing our efforts at the state level. Nigeria is a country with 36 different states and 774 local government areas. Each of those 36 states are governed by powerful state governors, some of them that oversee the administration of populations that are larger than some populations in some smaller West African countries, and also oversee budgets that are also larger than the budgets of some individual countries on the continent. So we took this approach of working at the state level, and since then we've been implementing a program to advance accountable governance and state-society relationships by strengthening Nigeria's state-level peace-building architecture. In doing this, we implement activities that target Nigeria's institutions of conflict resolution, security, and democratic governance to bridge the gap between communities and the federal government, between communities, between communal and national conflicts, and between local and national peace initiatives. There are gaps that exist at each of these levels, and being able to understand those gaps ensures that you're able to design the right interventions to engage. To get this work done, we try to bring together the different state governors and national policymakers and civic leaders together to design and implement inclusive policies that can mitigate violence in their communities, promote inclusion, and also strengthen community-oriented security. Now, it is clear from the opening remarks that there has been a spread of a higher risk of atrocities across Nigeria, particularly in northern Nigeria. And for many of this, for some of the reasons that were alluded to in the opening remarks. But in a lot of these communities, there are also several local early warning and early response systems that have been designed by local communities to mitigate these types of atrocities and also mitigate violence through information sharing and capacity building. However, the strengths vary across these different systems, but there are similar structural and operational problems that constrain the ability of these systems to prevent, mitigate, and respond to these conflicts. Now, for example, a lot of these systems are often designed, typically hampered by their narrow design by being just focused on the community level alone, which is great. But when you focus specifically on the community level at the expense of effective coordination with state government actors that have the appropriate authority and resources to actually respond. So you might have early warning about a conflict or a situation that's about to happen, but without the coordination, response will be lacking. So that gap needs to be addressed. There are also gaps that exist between and overlapping systems of early warning and response across northern Nigeria and parts of the Middle Belt. And this over time has impeded learning from each other and information sharing with key actors, including the state governments and the security services. These are just two examples, but there are other examples as well. As we look at the local level, that there are other examples across the local level. So for us at USIP, we've seen that it's extremely important to build or improve on both the horizontal and vertical connections that exist between community systems and the key response government actors at the state level. This can help mitigate the abuses and also improve accountability, which is key, improving accountability and response. As I mentioned, this is where USIP has been focusing our efforts since 2015, supporting Nigerian-led initiatives, such as the Nigeria Working Group on Peace Building and Governance, which is an alliance of eminent religious, human rights, academic, and Nigerian civic leaders who work specifically to connect and inform community, state, and national level priorities and actions. We also try to make sure that we partner with Nigerian national policymakers and civic leaders to ensure that they're working together to shape more inclusive policy platforms and action agendas aimed at preventing violent conflicts and addressing Nigeria's needs that they've identified on their own. And now the third point is really on learning. As Dwight mentioned earlier in your comments, we've invested and we've invested in years in Nigeria. And I think it is time for us to really think about how we've invested and looking at the knowledge that we have generated over time. What has worked? What does not work? And why hasn't it worked? Being able to take that time to learn from what we have done will strengthen our engagements. So USIP has supported and participated in multiple dialogue and interfaith mediation and peace building efforts across Nigeria Several other US-based organizations as well have done this, and we work very closely with our colleagues at the US Embassy and the State Department. In this work that we've done in Nigeria, we have seen the commitment of Nigerian leaders and communities to come together to resolve differences and lay the groundwork for shared sustainable peace. It is important for us to pick and generate lessons, generate knowledge, and try to figure out what has worked, what hasn't worked, and why it hasn't worked. And this could help us think about how we engage or continue to engage at the state and local level. Hopefully the new adoption of the Global Fragility Act, which among other things focuses US foreign assistance on preventing violence and conflict in fragile states, creates an important opportunity for us now to improve our knowledge base of what works and what does not work, and hopefully can help us build a culture of ongoing learning and adaptation across the different US agencies and international organizations that work in Nigeria. In other words, as we adapt our work and to the short-term conflicts that may arise in northern Nigeria in the Middle Belt, it's also important for us to strategize for the long term, because a long-term strategy will be helpful as we think through our engagement with state and local government actors in Nigeria. So I'll turn it back to you, Dwight, and look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Ms. Onubogu. I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge our Vice Chair, Tony Perkins, who joined us late due to technical difficulties, but give him the floor to say a few words. Vice Chair Perkins.
Well, thank you, Dwight, and I thank Commissioner Davie for covering for me as I was experiencing some challenges. We're having some weather challenges where I'm at, in addition to having operator technical difficulties on this end. So thank you for your patience and understanding. I really appreciate what was just been shared, and I think this is an approach that I think has a lot of merit as we have, as you say, learning from history. We've seen that a centralized approach to this problem has not been working. So very interested in hearing more about how we might approach this from a decentralized standpoint and working with the states. I think this does hold a lot of promise. So very grateful for each of our participants today in this hearing, as this commission is very, very concerned about Nigeria and very much focused on making recommendations that will be helpful in trying to bring stability, at least from our perspective, as it pertains to religious freedom and how religion is being used there in Nigeria. So thank you for participating today. And Dwight, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Perkins. All right, why don't we move on to Dr. Obasi? Why don't you go ahead? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Tony Perkins. Thank you, Commissioner Davie. Thank you, Dwight and Oge. I'll try to go to just two questions quickly. The background has been already set very excellently by those who spoke before me. And so I'll try to look at the role of state and local authorities in engaging in or tolerating violations of religious freedoms and more broadly human rights in Nigeria. And then secondly, I'll look at the opportunities for international partners, especially the United States, to assist local actors, state governments, civil society organizations, and others to promote religious freedom for all Nigerians. The first point I would like to make is that Nigeria constitutionally, is a secular state. It guarantees freedom of religion, including the right to hold preferred views, to promote one's beliefs, or even change from one religion to another. And so on the face of it, the government says, our constitution allows freedom of religion. We have no problem with violations. It's not our policy. You can look at our constitution, and that's correct. I think we should also recognize that there are federal, state, and local government responsibilities. But at each of these levels, the Constitution requires the governments to guarantee an environment in which these rights, the rights of religious freedom, are exercised freely, and those exercising them are duly respected. I think the rules are also very clarified for the various levels of government in the Constitution. So it all looks very good, on paper. But let's be very clear about this. Anyone who claims that there are no questions about religious liberty in Nigeria, as a senior Nigerian government official did recently, is either being willfully delusional or is being downright dishonest. There are many questions, and in fact, there are real problems that we need to address. And so I will also try to highlight 3 points that we need to note before going into the discussion. First, that under the Nigerian Constitution, while the state governors are quite powerful in several respects, as Oge already explained, it also happens that the instruments for guaranteeing and enforcing rights, including religious rights, are controlled not by state governments, not by local governments, but by the federal government. In other words, the security services, the police, the intelligence services, etc., that are sometimes necessary, the instruments to intervene in cases where there are going to be fears of massive human rights violations in conflict situations. These instruments are with the federal government, and therefore there's a limit to what state governments can do against violations of those freedoms. Secondly, I think we also bear in mind that Nigeria is a relatively young democracy, and the democratic values have not percolated down the system. And therefore, people and governors still are guided by the culture, the values, the dispositions of the states, of the dominant groups within their states, rather than strictly by the Constitution. So on the face of it, they talk about the Constitution, but in reality, they are guided by the culture, values, and dispositions of the people around them, especially the dominant groups. And therefore, thirdly, arising from the first 2 points I have made, is that while governors and local actors can sometimes be very constructive influences in guaranteeing religious freedoms and other human rights, they can sometimes also be the central driving factors in stoking, enabling, or abetting violations of religious freedom and other rights. And they do this through a combination of either deliberate policies or by deficits and failures in policy, which then creates very enormous problems. I'll just run through that very quickly. First of all, the active policies about regulating preaching, which in some states demands clerics to register with the state authority, obtain preaching permits, and then these permits can be withdrawn, and the clerics can sometimes be banned for preaching what the government considers inciting. So that's the first abridgment of religious freedoms. And then, of course, the second level of regulating religious education and saying that people cannot be taught a child cannot be taught anything about the other religion. If you are Christian, you can't be taught about Islam. If you are Muslim, you can't be taught about Christianity for fear that children may be converted and so on. And that's again an abridgment of religious freedom. Then the third level is the action of proscribing some sects, as we saw with the Islamic movement of Nigeria, the Shia group, or evicting religious communities from some particular locations in the country. Clerics say that all of these constitute violations of religious rights, but of course the governments say that these are measures taken in the overriding public interest, that they are necessary for maintenance of peace, to curb child abuse, to protect public health, and so on and so forth. That's an argument that still continues going on, but it's an important area to look at if we're looking at religious freedom in Nigeria. The second aspect of religious freedom is about denying rights, definitely denying rights, and imposing mores, values that are influenced, inspired by religion, onto the rest of the society. In many cases, we have had Christian religious leaders in the north complaining about denial of land applications and building permits for constructing worship centers, or the use of zoning regulations to stop or slow down the establishment of new worship centers. The government say this is not a systematic violation, it's a random and isolated cases, but many of the clerics believe that this is a deliberate effort to limit what they can do and where they can go. There's also the question of imposition of religiously inspired social mores. The belief is that in the Sharia northern states, that the Sharia applies only to Muslims. But the reality is that the Sharia has been used to generate or create values that are applicable to the rest of society. Segregation of the sexes, limitations, the consumption and transportation of alcohol, those kinds of things. The same thing happens in the South anyway. In the largely Christian South, Muslims complain that the state establishments are sometimes disrespectful of their religious values and of their religious freedom. So you find that in certain establishments, ladies come with the hijab and they are turned away because, no, we don't want to see people wearing hijab in this kind of place. But that is also a violation of religious freedom. So we need to look at that across the board, not just in specific locations. I think the third thing is that also many times religious groups, religious minorities are also parts of smaller ethnic minorities, and these are discriminated against using what we call the dichotomy between indigents and settlers, the laws that are made to favor people who have been in a particular location for much longer time than those who came from somewhere. So it works against Christians in the north and the far north, and against Muslims in the south. But either way, it's an important factor in cutting down the freedoms of religion for both Christians and Muslims. But the most serious problems are the failures of the governments. And this cuts across federal, state, and local government levels. And I'll highlight at least 4 dimensions of failure. The first is that governments are not doing enough to address the underlying economic, political, environmental causes that trigger and drive violence. Secondly, they are not doing enough at the state level to secure federal government commitment to protecting communities. We have had, like Commissioner Davie said, cases after cases in which communities, in recent times have been attacked persistently. People are killed, houses of religious worship are burnt, and at the end of the day, nobody is arrested. Communities are virtually, defenseless. The state governments plead they are handicapped because they don't have the federal instruments, but then they're not engaging sufficiently, from our point of view, they're not engaging sufficiently well with the federal government to get protection for these communities. Related to that is they are not doing enough to arrest, prosecute, and sanction the perpetrators of violence and religious rights abuse. We have thousands of people killed, thousands of people displaced, thousands of people maimed, and then the small numbers that are arrested are not diligently prosecuted. And at the end of the day, there is an air of impunity all over the environment. I think the next point is also about not doing enough for persons and groups that have been violated, whose religious rights and freedoms have been violated, in terms of relief, in terms of justice, compensation, damage for material losses, and rehabilitation and closure. Some of these failures are due to a lack of will to protect religious rights of all citizens, but in certain areas also, there also a lack of capacity. For instance, the judicial capacity to prosecute, to investigate, and so on is terribly lacking, in a lot of the states. I was seeing somewhere the other day, the country had about 2,000 judges, and at the moment it has 151,000 cases pending in court. So you can imagine how long that would take, to dispense with those cases. So there's a lack of will to deal with these issues, but also a deficit in capacity, to deal with them. So then what are the opportunities? What can the US and other partners do? I would say the first thing they can do is in engagement with state government officials and others across the country, civil society organizations, traditional rulers, religious leaders, first of all, voice greater concern over abuses and discrimination on the basis of religion. This issue doesn't come up as frequently as it should. It doesn't come up as loudly as it should, but I think that is the first thing to do, to step up the messaging about this and how unacceptable it is. Then I think it's also necessary to emphasize to governors and local authorities the need for greater respect for the principles of religious freedom and equitable treatment of people of all faiths, whether they are Muslim, they are Christian, they are animists, they are atheists, and so on. That message also has to be driven, further. And then the third is to also push state governments to engage better with the federal government and its security agencies to ensure protection for communities, to ensure early response to distress calls, and to ensure that those responses are actually effective in repelling, attacks on religious communities. And then, of course, the fourth is to support state governments to boost their capacity for full criminal investigations, prosecutions, and sanctions. As we mentioned earlier, a great element of what is happening is the impunity in the environment, and therefore it's necessary to scale up the judicial response in order to ensure sanctions, in order to discourage impunity. More practically, there's also the need to lend support to governments and other actors to expand interfaith forums. The forums have been, successful in certain areas, but they are too few, and they are not deep enough. We need to create forums that involve women, forums that involve youth, and so on and so forth, and deepen the discussions at each of these forums across the board. Secondly, there's need to support civil society organizations, communal dialogues, peace commissions set up by some of the state governments. A good idea, but again, handicapped by capacity and vision and so on. I think it's necessary to lend support from outside on that. I think it's also necessary to sponsor forums in which local, religious, political, and other leaders can gain a better understanding of what the Constitution provides for in terms of enhancing the respect for religious freedoms. Finally, I think it's necessary to support state governments in creating avenues for recognizing individuals, organizations, and so on that are doing constructive work in promoting freedoms and promoting interfaith harmony and so on, and empowering those organizations to do more. We're in a situation where there's almost no reward for doing good. Now there's no reward for supporting religious freedoms. There's no reward for supporting respect for human rights and so on and so forth. Could we create something that recognizes people who do that and encourages them and empowers them to do a little better? The two final points I'd like to make, going back to the point Oge made earlier on, is the need to approach Nigeria with a little more circumspection. I think it's a much more sophisticated society than we look at it sometimes. I mean, even for some of us who are within Nigeria, it's a pretty complex place. And in that sense, I would want to say that, first of all, the US and US actors should, as much as possible, avoid framing these issues as an attack against Christians. Sometimes these conflicts are so complex that we don't really know who is who, but they happen that people are killed in a Christian environment. Yes, there's been a lot of killing of Christians, but there's also a lot of killing of Muslims as well. And that brings me to the second point, that if we are talking about human rights and religious freedoms and so on and so forth, we shouldn't limit the discussion to the middle belt. There is a lot of violations that are taking place in the Northwest as well, and in other parts of the country. I think we should frame the discussion broadly about religious freedoms and human rights across Nigeria as a whole, rather than specifying to the middle belt. Admittedly, horrendous things have happened in the middle belt, but then also in other parts of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of our guest panelists for your overview and context. Before I start with an opening question, let me remind the audience to ask a question by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Thank you to those who've already started asking a few questions. Now, a lot was just touched on between Ms. Onubogu and Dr. Obasi on the context and some of the problems. Let me ask you point blank here. Would direct engagement with state authorities, you've talked about supporting civil society, but you've also talked about technical assistance to authorities, be that on judicial support to conduct investigations and police training, et cetera. What would that look like? Is that even possible to bypass federal authorities? You've talked about the lack of will, the lack of capacity. So if we are going to get to engage, whether it's Plateau State, Kano State, Kaduna State, what would that potentially look like? And are you aware of foreign governments that have already started doing some of this? There has been a lot of support, as you alluded to. USIP has been working on this. Other organizations have been conducting conflict resolution, mitigation, and reconciliation efforts. But can you tell us what has been going on and what could potentially be something? Maybe we'll start with Ms. Onubogu, if you could touch on these.
Sure. Thanks, Dwight. So as I had mentioned earlier, there are already ongoing efforts engaging directly with the state governors. Nnamdi spoke about the different peace-building agencies that different states have created, like you have the State Peace-Building Agency in Plateau, the Kaduna State Peacebuilding Commission in Kaduna, and a commission as well in Adamawa. And there are other states as well that are also thinking about setting up their own commissions, because I think there is a growing realization that a lot of conflict starts local. And it's important to think about how we address those conflicts at the local level, at the state level, and the state governors are the closest to the people. Now, even as you engage with the state governors, a point that was made by Nnamdi, I believe, is that we also have to make sure we build that relationship with the federal. We build the capacity of the state governments to engage with the federal governments, because a lot of the security architecture is controlled by the federal. The police is controlled by the federal. If a crisis breaks out in a small community in Plateau State, obviously you have a notice that goes up to Abuja to have police officers sent in, even though you have different joint task force and the rest of that. But then it still goes back to another point too as well, that Nigeria is also significantly under-policed. There are not enough police officers. So we are engaging directly with state governors, but as you engage with them, making sure that you build that link, that we also build their capacity to be able to engage with the federal. You need them to be able to work side by side. And that is really the work that USIP is doing in Nigeria today.
Dr. Obasi, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, just Oge has said it pretty well. I just would like to add that in spite of the constraints of the state governments, they do have quite some latitude about what they can do without waiting for approval for the federal government. In various sectors, in agriculture, in education, and so on and so forth, they do enter into contracts and agreements with foreign partners, and they get along with projects that sometimes do not require authorization from the federal government. So I think in this regard, there's a room for engaging directly with the state governments and then helping them to build capacity in some of these areas without having to wait for the federal government. In other areas, of course, there has to be some collaboration between the state government, the federal government, and the external partner. But we could address them on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. I wanted to check before I launch into some audience questions now if Vice Chair Perkins or Commissioner Davie wanted to weigh in at this particular time.
I don't have any questions. I'm just taking lots of notes here.
Okay.
I'm curious about, if I might, local customs at the state level that you talked about, if I understood correctly, that may have more of an influence on the governors and other officials in those states than the actual law or the Constitution. Can you say a little bit more about that, if I understood it correctly, and then maybe some ways for addressing it?
Okay, let me go back, out of the traditional, as we say, the traditional grazing area, the Middle Belt and the North, and actually move to the Niger Delta, for instance. We have had a governor of Rivers State who said Rivers State is a Christian state. And he said it very emphatically without any apologies. Now, that runs against the provision of the Constitution that says that this is a secular country. So we also have had governors in Rivers State, Bayelsa State and in Akwa Ibom State who have built, auditoriums, 10,000 capacity and so on. They call them ecumenical centers for Christian, worship. And so those are people who are being driven by, the environment, which is largely Christian, the fact that, they have political calculations that this would favor them in the long run. And therefore they have no consideration, no real regard for the Constitution that talks about against separation of church and state. So we have also those kinds of things in the North, in which governors and others, surrounded by a very strongly and densely Islamic environment, sometimes, bow more to the pressures of the clerics and the ulama than to whatever the Constitution provides for. I think there's a problem now with the Al-Majiri, the Quranic education, for instance. On the one hand, the governors are saying, this is not healthy, this is not, say from a security point of view, we're only creating children that, Boko Haram will come and recruit sometime. But then at the same time, you're in an environment where the religious clerics are saying, the ulamas, the clerics are saying, look, this is our way of doing things. And if you don't go with it, we'll mobilize people to vote you out by the next election. So they are torn between the environment, the realities of the environment, the cultural and religious realities of that environment, and what the Constitution, which for them is an abstract document, in a sense, is saying. That's the sense in which I mean that they are torn between, culture and Constitution.
Thank you.
Great. Why don't we get to an audience question? There's a few that overlap here. So let me try to ask you for our panelists here. There's some NGOs that work with local partners in areas of conflict resolution and religious persecution. Priority right now is the Middle Belt. Another is in Kaduna, where thousands have been displaced. So in this particular question, the UK government apparently is not providing aid in this region at the present time. Could you shed some light, if you're aware of, what other are aid organizations, other groups meeting the needs of displaced IDPs, those in need who are suffering from this violence, and then are displaced and are in need? Is there adequate support for these individuals in the Middle Belt and Kaduna State?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, I would say right away that the response to the humanitarian situation in the Middle Belt and the Northwest is a long way from satisfactory. The whole response so far, the effort has been tied up in the Northeast. And even in the Northeast, there's a certain degree of fatigue as this has drawn ahead for a very long time. So whether we talk about the Middle Belt or we talk about the Northwest, at the time we were working on the Northwest, doing a report on the Northwest in May last year, we had 260,000 people displaced, 60,000 of them into Niger Republic. But there was very little that was being done by humanitarian agencies to respond to that. So that's why I also mentioned earlier on that one of the areas where the US and other international partners can step in is in providing relief and livelihood recovery to communities that have been traumatized and displaced by these kinds of violence. That's also part of the healing process that is required to rebuild interfaith bridges as time goes on.
Ms. Onubogu, did you want to respond?
No, I don't have anything to add on there. I believe Nnamdi has covered the question well. But I think for me, one thing that I will add to as well, in addition, is just on the learning front, on the learning side. As we look at the numbers of internally displaced people in the Middle Belt, several years ago when USIP started our program, we had basically said that a lot of the elements that exist in the environment in Northeast Nigeria also exist in other parts of Northern Nigeria. And now we see the crisis, as Nnamdi alluded to, that is happening in the Northwest. And then we see other things happening in the Middle Belt. So as we think about the support, also incorporating learning so that we are able to be proactive and not reactive, because we're always several steps behind in the case of Nigeria when it comes to providing this type of assistance. So really being able to prioritize learning will help inform how we also respond.
Thank you for that. Another question directed specifically to you, Ms. Onubogu. Inclusivity is critical to effective engagement of state and civil society actors on the issue of freedom of religion or belief. How does the USIP ensure inclusivity and equality of religious and non-religious, including atheists and humanist persons, in its activities?
I think over the years, USIP's work, we have developed models and a system to ensure that there is clear inclusion across the board, regardless of gender, regardless of religion, religious identity. We try to make sure that all groups are engaged in the system, in the conversation. One, not only in the dialogue process, but also in identifying what the problem is. And that's a very important step that we take at USIP, that when we engage in the community, we may know from what we read in the newspapers or from how we engage with communities about what the problem is. But you need the communities to actually identify the problems themselves. Once they're able to identify the problems, then the process of resolving them or working towards resolving them is organic and Nigerian-led. So that's a process and a model that USIP has built over time. And we have implemented this not only in Nigeria, but in over 50 different countries that we work in, making sure that the identification of the problem is a community-led effort, and that all the stakeholders, the community, identifies the individuals that should be part of the conversation, also identifying very early on what the possible risk could be and how to mitigate them.
Thank you. Another question to all the panelists from someone from Nigeria. The complexity is that Nigeria, you talked about instruments for intervening to address religious freedom violations, human rights violations, and that's residing with the federal government in terms of the response. Wouldn't devolution of powers or restructuring, as Nigerians like to call it, be a way to remedy this problem so that governors would be in position to intervene immediately rather than waiting for the federal authorities, who sometimes come in with excessive power, and sometimes it takes a long time for them to respond? Any of the panelists on that one?
Yes, I could respond. I totally share the sentiments of the participants who asked the questionnaire. I think we are moving in that direction. It's a question of how to control the process so that it doesn't generate, more problems and the true solutions that we are seeking. Otherwise, I think there's clearly an understanding now that a great deal more, some of the powers for enforcing laws has to be transferred to the state level. It actually looks like an anomaly, an absolute anomaly, that state legislatures can make laws but have no instruments whatsoever to enforce the laws that they make until they get assistance from the federal government. So over time, it's a process that is already on. I mean, it's inevitable that some of the powers for enforcement and security will be devolved from the center, to the states in order to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we are facing. And it's not just about religious freedom. It's also about wider issues of insecurity that now require a much closer grassroots response than waiting for a response to come from Abuja.
And I think just to add to that too as well, definitely agree that the conversations are moving in that direction. At least we've seen them in the last couple of years moving in that direction. And there seems to be will on the side of some political actors and acknowledgement that there needs to be more powers at the state level. I think just as the conversation evolves, just that point of caution in making sure that it's not taken over by political actors or taken over for political reasons. And I think, as we talk about religious freedoms, as we talk about human rights, and as we think about all the different issues in Nigeria, one of the underlying causes that basically ties all of this together is really an issue of governance. And so really thinking about how we address the key governance questions in Nigeria to be able to inform and strengthen conversations around restructuring or strengthening religious freedoms and human rights, really being able to prioritize that conversation around strengthening governance in the country.
Thank you. There's a series of questions related to more specifics on the programs and initiatives on interfaith, with interfaith leaders, interfaith programs. For those that have been following Nigeria for a while, you recall the pastor and the imam, the two who have been doing work. There's been a documentary and so on. The question is, how effective has this been? Is it still getting the kind of support, this interfaith activity? Have you seen some fruits in particular states that could considered best practices that would work in these conflict areas that seem to be perpetuating the same kinds of things that ignite the conflict? Are we just simply doing this work but not learning and not tripping over the same mistakes over and over again? Well, and what can we do potentially to make these more effective to get out and affect people?
So definitely that work on interfaith mediation with the imam and the pastor with the Interfaith Mediation Network was actually supported by USIP over a decade ago, bringing those two communities together in Yelwa Shandam in the Middle Belt in Plateau State, bringing them together to resolve a conflict. And through a process of facilitated dialogues and mediation, these communities were able to come together to sign a peace pact. And it's been over 13 years, and that community is still at peace from that effort. Now, the peace is still fragile, going back to the points that I made about the underlying governance issues. And that peace pact that was signed and that work that USIP did in interfaith mediation actually served as a learning process for us to help inform our ongoing work in the country today. Because we noticed that even though the communities had reached a point where they had reconciled and there was a fragile peace, that some of the issues that actually led to the conflict in the first place, like locating a common market, some key issues had not been addressed by the government. And to be able to address those types of issues, that's when you need the government actors and the policymakers to be part of the conversation. And so that informed our work moving forward, that even as you have interfaith mediation efforts, making sure that those community voices are tied to policymakers that have the responsibility. They may not necessarily have the capacity at the time, but they have the responsibility, and we can work with them to ensure that they respond or address some of those underlying issues that can end up making the conflict spiral. I think an interesting thing for us too as well that has helped inform our work moving forward is that with the mediation, the Yelwa Shandam, the imam and the pastor episode, the current governor of Plateau State today was actually the speaker of the Plateau State House of Assembly when that event happened. So he comes with the learning of being involved in that process and has taken that information to create the Plateau State Peacebuilding Agency as it stands today. Now, there are still gaps, but I think what we see are some signs of movement. And how can we take what we have learned to ensure we build upon these opportunities that we've seen? Because at the end of the day, we can mediate, we can lead a mediation process or support a mediation process. But for it to be sustainable, it has to be owned by the community. And so we should push for Nigerian-led initiatives to be able to ensure sustainability. So I think it really goes back to the last point that I made in my initial presentation, the point about learning. We have implemented a lot of interfaith mediation type of discussions in Nigeria. Some of them have worked, some of them have not been as successful, some of them have been partially successful. And what have we learned from them, and how can we apply those lessons moving forward?
As we're running short on time, I wanted to make sure that Vice Chair Perkins or Commissioner Davie had any final word before we wrap up today.
Only once again to thank our panelists for joining us and giving us greater insight into this decentralized approach to the problem. Obviously, a lot more to explore, but want to thank you for your input today, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And we, as I said, I was taking notes here for other aspects that we may want to follow up with in the future. So thank you again for joining us today.
And I echo Vice Chair Perkins' comments and appreciation for your being here and participating in this panel for what is a rich and informative discussion about the issues of decentralization and issues of religious freedom, freedom of religion and freedom of belief. So again, thank you, and look forward to a conversation with you, ongoing conversation, in particular, another public conversation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists, Oge Onubogu and Nnamdi Obasi. Again, I'll echo what our commissioners, and thanks to our commissioners for joining today. I also want to thank Madeline Velturo, Usurp's policy analyst who covers Nigeria, as well as Thomas Kramer for their work on this event. If you'd like to learn more about Usurp's work on Nigeria and our policy recommendations, I encourage you to visit our website at www.usurp.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and issues in the months ahead. Thank you all again.